everyone, back to Evermore YouTube channel. Happy New Year, by the way. It's Chris back with my rant stroke thought of the year, not of the day, which I normally do. I thought it's the start of 2026. Let's get in and let's talk about how I think the year may play out for Newcastle United, some of the things that could potentially happen. And it's all dependent really on what we do in the coming transfer market and whether the manager, Eddie Howe, can turn this around or not. Before I continue, I do hope you had a cracking New Year's Eve, whatever you were doing. If you're feeling rough today, sit down, have a Barocca, have a cup of coffee, have a chocolate biscuit, have something to soak up the bevy and sit and chill and listen to me talk about Newcastle United. And if you like this kind of a thing, smash subscribe and help get us to the next milestone. We surpassed 4 million views in total on YouTube on New Year's Eve. Mark sent it to me and we said Happy New Year to each other, and it was absolutely class. So thank you so much for everyone who's viewed and commented and shared and subscribed and like the videos, super chats, the whole shebang. We really, really do appreciate it more than you can ever know. It's not what we do full time. We do it on the side, but we really enjoy doing it. And we enjoy the fact that you guys enjoy it too. But let's get stuck in to Newcastle United. And 2025 for Newcastle was a great year really on paper when you look at it. So Newcastle United qualified for the Champions League, obviously, again. But more importantly, they won a trophy, the first trophy in 70 years. And that was under Eddie Howe. And he did an amazing job to do it. You know, beating Liverpool in the final 2-1 at Wembley, Dan Burns scoring the goal, and then he who shan't be named now because he's left the football club, scoring the second goal. The parade through the town, I was looking to be at the parade, wasn't looking to be at Wembley, but just because you're not at a game doesn't mean you didn't feel the feels that everyone felt in the stadium and around the world to see Newcastle lift some silverware. And we thought we were on cloud nine. We had a brilliant squad. We had a world-class centre forward. We had arguably the best midfield in the Premier League. A lot of people were saying we had two of the most exciting young fullbacks. The Premier League was losing Trent Alexander-Arnold to Real Madrid that summer. Robertson's getting old, so you're looking at Tino and Hall thinking these two could be the future for, you know, not just Newcastle, but England as well in terms of the fullbacks and the best fullbacks in the Premier League. So we went into the summer full of optimism, thought everything was going to be great. And then disaster hit. Alexander Isak hit. The whole scandal of Alexander Isak wanting to leave. I was at Celtic in pre-season when the whole thing broke. And there was a guy standing next to me in the stadium, actually, and he said they were in the hotel and he saw Isak leave the hotel. And, you know, this was before anybody was talking about it. And then it all kind of came out of the wash. Obviously, Isak was wanting to leave. There was talk about promises broken. He didn't come on the tour over to the Far East. He was told to stay at home, and then he didn't stay at home. He went and trained with Sociedad. It was a complete and not a hot mess. Newcastle went for striker after striker, got knocked back. They went for Ekitike, got knocked back. They went for Benjamin Sesko, got knocked back. You know, if you believe what you hear, went from Buemo, got knocked back. All these other players got knocked back. From Liam Delap, got knocked back. And it was just a complete and utter disaster. There was no director of football there because Mitchell had left. The CEO wasn't in position. Darren Eales was ill. And it couldn't have been more of a disaster after what was an unbelievable season for Newcastle United, the best season they've had in the modern era. To follow it up with a complete and utter disaster and clusterfuck of a summer was just so frustrating for all of us as supporters. But we all had to go through it. These smarmy Liverpool fans giving a shit about the Isak thing. We thought for one moment that Isak maybe would return to the fold, that he wouldn't go there because it looked like Newcastle were digging their heels in and wanting to keep the player. But as it transpired, he did go. Liverpool. It's not worked out very well for Alex or for Liverpool either, to be honest with you. We had Johan Visser from Brentford who left under a similar cloud, not as bad as Alexander Isak. You know, he was a bit more respectful of Brentford towards the end when it all went through, but he got injured 2 games in. So we didn't have Wisser either. We signed Nick Voltemada. We didn't really know anything about him. Come in, he did a good job, you know, but we're closing on 2025. You know, we finished it now. We're in 2026. And the tide has really turned a lot for Newcastle United in such a short period of time. We had a disastrous summer. There's no doubt about it. And without anybody at the helm, you've got to look no further than Eddie Howe in terms of the players that were signed. Now, there's a real divide in a fan base right now. I've done loads of videos about this, and I think I'll continue to talk about this until either A, Eddie turns this around, which I'll get to in a second, whether I think he will or not in this big year of 2026, or B, Eddie gets sacked. You know, and this is the issue that we have right now. So people are totally split on the manager. Some people have thought the manager has taken the club as far as he can go. He's done a brilliant job so far, and anything that he has achieved in the past should not be underplayed, but he's not maybe the man to take Newcastle forward into, you know, being a regular top 4 contender, pushing for the titles, winning domestic trophies every single season, you know, fighting on all fronts and utilizing squads effectively. He's not that guy. And that's where I sit in that camp. And I try to make my point calmly, you know, and logically about the situation. And then you've got an ultra positive camp who think Eddie is God and King and can do no wrong. And, he's won the trophy, he can do whatever he wants. It doesn't matter whether he doesn't pick this guy or that guy. You're wrong. He's never wrong. And then in the middle, there's fans who maybe do support Eddie, but are having serious doubts, and I think that level of the fan base is probably a lot bigger than people think. But if you put your head above the parapet, certainly on social media or on platforms like this, you're there to be attacked by people. I mean, I've stopped posting on the ever more social media platforms because you just get nothing but abuse. I find this platform a lot more healthy, a lot more open for discourse. You can talk about difference of opinions. I've had people in the comments talking to me in a nice, civil way. I've replied back. I always try to reply to comments. I don't like to ignore people. When you make a comment on this channel, you make the effort to make a comment. If it's a comment that's constructive and you want to have a discussion about football, I'm happy to have a discussion with football about you. But if you're just going to shout and call somebody a wanker or a prick for not believing what you believe, and that's pointless. There's no point in doing that at all. Go on social media, go on the toilet bowl, skid mark that is X and crack on, because that's not what our comment section is all about. And as I always say, if you're going to be a prick, you get the flick. But the situation that we have right now, there's no doubt about it. Newcastle United have finished 2025 probably a lot worse than they would have wanted to. And from last season, it seems like a world apart from where we were in terms of the excitement, the anticipation going into the summer, going into next season. Could we really be, one of the kind of top three teams, top two, teams in the Premier League? We needed it last season until we fell over towards the end. And then, the reasons for it, the mitigations of Isaac down in tools, allegedly, and all this other noise that comes out into the wash. But the fact that Newcastle have had such a bad transfer window, and the fact that we've been such a mess upstairs, I don't blame the mess upstairs on Eddie Howe. I generally don't. Just to part the Eddie Howe thing for a minute. There's a lot of things I do hold Eddie Howe accountable for. And I think in this year going forward, I think we're going to see how important they are to the owners. But I do believe that PIF have fell asleep at the wheel a little bit here. They've maybe put a bit too much trust in the Rubens, who don't know a lot about football, who've appointed people who maybe weren't the right people for the football club. Darren Eales, I'm glad that he's maybe getting the help that he needs. I know he's been poorly, and, I do wish him good health and happiness for 2026. I hope that Darren Eales, gets himself back to a really good, healthy, full strength position. He seemed like a lovely fella. There's no doubt about that. But he didn't have any football now. So that's the problem. And he brings people in like Silverstone, who maybe talks the talk, gets to a certain point, and then can't get any further. There was some small commercial wins, I think, with this team, but they haven't done enough really outside of Stack, in, I think, a lick of paint and a training ground. There's nothing to really show for, the richest owners in the world and the project plans, and we want to be number one and all that. And they've appointed now David Hopkinson, who's come out and said the same bullshit that Amanda Staveley said a few years ago. And he's making a rod for his own back. He doesn't need to do that. He doesn't need to tell people that we're going to be number one in 5 years, because all it does is it puts down that marker. It puts that out on print for people to refer back to. And it isn't just Newcastle fans, it's other fans who are going to take the piss out of Newcastle when you don't achieve those standards. And I know people say, kind of shoot for the moon and or whatever, shoot for the stars and land on the moon, or whatever that saying goes. But he's just making himself look daft. And he's talking to people in the Stack who are lapping it all up, like happy clappy seals. And that's not me slagging them off. That's exactly what they like. That whatever these people come out and feed you in terms of a line, you guys seem to swallow with double helpings. I'm maybe too pragmatic or too negative to feel that way. And that isn't because I don't go to matches regularly. I am, by the way, going to the match this week, and I do go to the occasional match. Don't have a season ticket. Gave it up years ago, and it's hard to get a ticket for Newcastle because the stadium's too small. I'll get into that in a second as well. But that doesn't mean that you can't have an opinion and your opinion isn't valid as a supporter. We've got supporters all over the world. We've got supporters in America and India and Canada and New Zealand and Africa and wherever else, as well as supporters in the UK and certainly in the region of the Northeast as well. It doesn't matter whether you go every single game or not. Your opinion as a Newcastle fan is valid, and you're entitled to your opinion, be it negative or positive, But I think the situation is this exciting new project has definitely stalled off the pitch and a little bit on the pitch as well. Off the pitch, probably more than on the pitch. And I will give Eddie Howe his respect for this. Eddie Howe has managed to do something with very kind of normal players that this ownership and our fan base probably never thought that he could do. We never thought he could turn Joe Linton into the player that he has been over the last 3 or 4 years for Newcastle. We never thought Jacob Murphy would become the player that he's been for the last 2 or 3 years. When Newcastle United, we never thought he would have got the levels out of a Sean Longstaff and Miggy Almiron for the time that he did. Dan Burn being the player that he's been. And that's all down to Eddie Howe's man management, his philosophy, and the way that he set his team up. And it has gained success for Newcastle. There is no doubt about that. But the issue with Eddie Howe, I'll come to in a second, is, it's not working anymore. But I'll come to this in a bit more detail in a second. So going back to the off the pitch stuff, the complete disarray in the merry-go-round of getting people into these positions who don't know anything about football is showing. It's mistake after mistake from the ownership, the Rubens and the PIF, who I think have got a distant interest in this. I know, that they're saying that they have got full interest in it and the backers and all that stuff. I'm not saying that they don't want it to succeed. I think any investment that the PIF throw their money behind, they want to succeed. But I don't feel like they're switched on and focused enough on the day-to-days of Newcastle United as they may be on the other things like the golf and the boxing and the Formula One. And I know there's not as many financial boundaries and restrictions in those sports that there is in the Premier League. And we know the reasons why the Premier League and the greedy six teams put this all in place to stop Newcastle becoming this big behemoth and buying all the best players, like City did in their takeover, like Chelsea did in their takeover. They stopped Newcastle doing that, and that's the reason why we can't be that club. But if you can't be that club, you've then got to rotate your playing squad more regularly. You've got to keep it fresh. You've got to have less over 30s in your squad than you do. You've got to be able to bring in new players, to challenge people, to get more out of players. You've got to be able to adapt, change your style when it gets figured out by people. And a lot of that comes from just a complacency and a over loyalty, certainly from Eddie Howe to certain players, but even the ownership to Eddie Howe. Now, Eddie Howe has done a brilliant job, but most shelf life of managers are 3 to 4 years, and Eddie Howe was past that point now, and things are stagnating, and things are going stale, and that leads me back into what I think 2026 could look like. But the biggest tester right now for 2026 will be this coming transfer window. The transfer window is open right now in January. It's open until February. And there's already talk about Newcastle being linked to players. And if the initial flavour of what's going on now is going to tell us anything, it is a little bit concerning as to what this window is going to bring us, because we keep getting linked to this 19-year-old French defender, 19-year-old Keith Schmidt, 21-year-old French under 21 goalkeepers, all that, right? And that's great. And they may be brilliant players, right? They may come in and be absolutely amazing and starting players. But the way that they're talking, if they're trying to build for the future, not for the present, and that's not what Newcastle need this transfer window. Newcastle need 2 or 3 players, 4 players even, to come into this squad to be ready-made first-team squad players. And I'll explain why in a minute, because of the age of the squad. But some of the initial interactions I'm hearing are worrying. There's talk of Ruben Neves, who's currently with, I think, is Al Hilal, former Wolves, Portuguese midfielder, can play centre-half as well. 28 years old, massive experience in the Premier League, can play defensive midfield or centre-half. I think he can do a job at right-back as well. I think I've seen him play there maybe for Wolves a couple of times or whatever. But he's an experienced player. He brings aggression. He brings that level of experience and a command of a midfield in terms of that defensive base. And we need that. We've lost control in midfield. And to get a player like that on loan from a club that the Saudis probably have links or ownership links to would be a really easy deal to do. But apparently, Ross Wilson's already saying he's only interested in players under 24. Now, that rules out so many possible players. Conor Gallagher, Atletico Madrid, for example, 25 years old, looking for more football before the World Cup. He would be another addition to the midfield. Premier League experience, energy, box to box, a freshness that is an area that's grown stale at the football club. But again, if Ross Wilson's only looking for people under 24, what we're building here, we're building for the future rather than the present. Is this because Eddie Howe is still trusting in the players that are there and they're not doing the job? I mean, the players that were brought in have not elevated the squad standards whatsoever, with the exception of Malik Chow and Nick Voltemade to a certain extent because of the goals that he scored. He has struggled a bit in recent weeks, and I think it's because the style of play that we have don't fit with the way Voltemade wants to play or the way that he needs to play. But the issue that we have is there's parts of this squad that are massively needing addressed. And I think this is the issue that we're going to have in this Jan transfer window. So just unpacking the squad itself. So I'm looking at the defense right now, which is the biggest issue that we have. So out of our 12 defenders in the squad right now, and I say 12, can you really count Leo Shahar, Harrison Ashby, and even Alex Murphy to an extent, because neither of them get a game, really? You're talking about 5 of those players that are well over 30. Kieran Trippier is 35. Fabian Schär is 34. Dan Burn is 33. Jamal Lascelles, I can't even believe he's still at the club, 32. Emil Kraft is 31. This is an area of the pitch that Eddie Howe has massively neglected in terms of freshening up over the years. And Tino Livramento and Sven Botman have both got really bad injury records. And they're both fantastic players. But while they're going to be as injury prone as they are, how we've not looked at that in the summer and thought that's something that needs to be addressed really worries me. Even without a director of football or a CEO, that falls then on the manager solely. How he's looked at that defensive unit and thought that's okay and that doesn't need to be addressed is a real concern. Yes, Malik Chow came in and he's the best of that bunch. There's no doubt about it. But it's a real worry that hasn't been looked at, and that needs to be looked at in January massively because we've lost Tino Livramento and Lewis Hall for parts already this season. There's no Dan Burn to fill in at left back when needed be. Kieran Trippier, like I say, the injuries are taking a toll because age is taking a toll. Fabian Schär is turning slower than the Titanic coming out of port at times because he's getting old. Kraft's injuries have lasted longer. Lascelles' injuries, he's been injured perpetually probably for the past 2.5 years. Like, these guys shouldn't be in this squad anymore. There should be younger players, kind of early and mid 20s, late 20s that are in that squad. And they're out there, those players. You can find those players by scouting, by looking. Steve Nixon was still at the club. Andy Howe was involved with Eddie Howe. Why do we not look at this area and try and work on it? It's a real big concern for me that that's not been addressed. Then you look at the summer transfer signings. The Elanga situation has not helped at all. We've spent 55 million quid on this kid in a window where you could have signed Mohamed Kudus for the same price and Buemo was available. Yes, he may have only wanted Manchester United, but the way they fucking dicked around and dilly-dally, we could have got into that deal if we were interested. Maybe it would never have worked, but we could have tried that. There's players abroad as well. Gittins went to Chelsea, for example, those kind of things. There's players that we could have brought into that position. Semenyo's another one. He had a 65 million quid release clause. Man City going to get that this January by the looks of it. Newcastle was sleeping on that transfer, but Eddie Howe has scouted this kid for 2 seasons. He's done nothing. He's offered nothing to this football club, and now he's not even picking him. And you're thinking, Jesus Christ, what's happened there? That's a dreadful sign. Jacob Ramsey, the same. Jacob Ramsey, come to Newcastle, supposed to be a Joe Willock upgrade. Joe Willock's still here. Didn't sell Joe Willock. And Joe Willock's actually putting in better performances than Jacob Ramsey, which is really concerning. So I don't know what's going to happen there. People are saying give the lads time, and I understand that. I get your positivity and I get your point of view. But when you come to a football club like ours, who has finite financial play, with the boundaries of PSR, regardless how rich our owners are, you can't afford to be spending 100 million quid on 2 duds. And that's what Elanga and Ramsey look like right now. And that falls back on the shoulders of Eddie Howe. He was the man in charge. He was the man with the final say. He was scouting the player, putting the bids together, getting the bids squared up, and he was involved in everything. Andy Howe and Steve Nixon were there, scouts too, yes, but Eddie Howe was the man at the final say. So those 2 duds sit in Eddie Howe's ledger, and he's got to deal with that. But a lot of fans will tell you you're not allowed to say that, but he has got to deal with that. I'm sorry, he does. Wissa, 2 goals, 2 starts. It's hard to write them off too early, but that whole transfer was a mess in terms of the way it happened from Brentford, the similarities to the Isak scenario. We didn't want to really be involved in that kind of negativity, but we were. And then, he buggers off to Congo with no football and does his knee. Now, that's bad judgment by Wissa. If Wissa had said to Congo, actually, I can't come, I barely had pre-season. I don't feel sharp enough. We probably would have had Wissa for the majority of the season, and we could be in a better league position now. And I could be talking a lot differently for this thought of the year, but we didn't. And now Vissa's back and he's fit and he wants to make up for lost time. He didn't go AFCON, which is great, but he's going to hopefully get a few goals towards the end of the season and help get us in a good position. But that leads me back to how I feel about the year ahead. So the January transfer window was massive. If Newcastle don't sign in key areas and sign the right players, then we're going to be in real trouble. We really, really are. And I think there's players at this football club who have already disengaged and are thinking about their next step. I think the Alexander Isak transfer caused way more trouble than any of us will ever understand fully. I think Sandro Tonali, for certain, his head has been turned, whether there's a homesick element there or not. I know his partner's just had a baby. Maybe they want to go back to Italy and raise a baby there. Maybe they don't like being in the Northeast. That can happen with players sometimes, regardless of what the club did for Sandro when he got banned from his gambling addiction and punishment. If the player isn't happy here and he's not settled in, his family's not settled here, it's difficult to keep the lad here. It really, really is. But they can't be in another position where they're playing a lad who doesn't want to be here. And you can see that Tonali, to me, is mentally checked out. Now, Some people say he's fatigued, he's tired. Maybe he is, but that then again goes back to the manager for not rotating the squad. We need a manager who can do that. If you're going to be the Newcastle United manager and you've got a squad of X and you won't rotate around that squad, then you're going to burn your players out. It's okay being in every single cup competition in January, as I'm talking to you now. But if you burnt your squad out to the point where they're not doing it in the Premier League, which is your bread and butter, you're actually mismanaging the squad. I would much rather, we'd have played weekend squads in Carabao Cups or FA Cups and maybe gone out earlier. The FA Cup, we might very well do that. We might go out the FA Cup. I'll get onto that prediction in a minute. But, he has to rotate the squad. He has to bring in other players, that are squad players. There's got to be more appearances from Ramsey and a Willock and a younger player like Leo Shahart right back, or Alex Murphy at centre-half, Sean Neave even leading the line. He's got to do that, because if he keeps playing those players, he's just going to burn them out, which is exactly what he's done. And they look dead on their feet. And he did this before when we were in the Champions League, and then we had a real struggle the season after where we finished 7th and probably would have got Europe if it wasn't for Manchester United somehow winning the FA Cup. But he's not learned from his mistakes there. And that concerns me very much about this manager. And I'll get into the manager in a bit more detail in a second. But going into the 2026 prediction, it's difficult to give you a full year's prediction because you're talking about two different parts of the year. So the first half of the year, January till May, is the season really. What can Newcastle do with this season, and can the manager turn this around? I've seen enough, I think, in the first half of this season to tell me that this is going to be a struggle unless there's some good investment in January, which freshens things up, which could happen. So I might be wrong, but I don't think the way the talking and the noises that they're making about younger players coming in, Eddie Howe doesn't put young players into teams. He keeps them locked away until they're Eddie ready, as I've referred to it as, and that's what he does. And we don't have the luxury of that time, but Eddie still takes that time because that's the way that he works as a manager and as a coach and as a developer of players. And sometimes it works really well. There was times we were screaming for Lewis Hall when Dan Burn was really struggling at left back. And he seems to have kept Lewis Hall back and cooked him to the point where he's turned him into an unbelievable left back. We saw shades of that from Hall when he broke through at Chelsea, to be brutally honest with you. So I'm not going to credit Hall with the total development of Lewis Hall because that player was there for me when he was already in a Chelsea shirt. But he has definitely helped him with a lot of his defensive frailties in that time period. But, the minute we have right now, the right back situation is an issue at the moment. Lewis Miley's been shoehorned in there. And for those of you out there who are saying Lewis Miley could be a right back moving forward, no chance. You're talking about a midfielder who's so comfortable on the ball. The kid never loses it. He keeps it moving. Simple passes back and forth, a bit like you would see from a Sergio Busquets and a Pedri even. I'm not saying he's anywhere near their level. If he gets to half of their level, we've got an unbelievable player in our hands. But don't ruin the kid's game by putting him in at right back because he happens to be a great footballer who can play there. Get him in the midfield because the midfield lacks control right now. Bruno Guimaraes is blowing because he's playing every game. Tonali's checked out, as I said before. Lewis Miley, right now, if we have a right back able to start a game, Lewis Miley has every right to expect or demand a midfield starting position in that team. Now, whether Eddie Howe has the balls to do that, if a right back comes back in, will remain to be seen. I'll get into that more probably in the Palace preview. But for me, Lewis Miley should be in the midfield. And I think what we've seen with him playing right back for Lewis Miley is it's helped his game develop. So he's better defensively now. He tracks runners better. He times tackles better. He stands up and blocks better. He wins duels better. And that'll make him a better all-around midfielder really going forward. But, the defense is a huge problem. And there's too many over 30s, as I said. Newcastle have to sign smart in January for that. But I don't know if they will. I think Howe will continue to be loyal to the likes of Share and Byrne and, and Kraft and maybe Trippier if he still stays. But there's always a Trippier going. I can maybe see that. If Trippier wants one last hurrah abroad or something, then maybe he can do that. But I think just genuinely, that defensive unit is way too old, as is the goalkeeper. Out of our 5 goalkeepers, I think 3 of them are over 30 as well. No, for a goalkeeper, that's quite young still, but we have a problem that Nick Pope's great with his hands and shit with his feet. And Ramsdale's good with his feet and shit with his hands. And he's only on loan. So between them two, they make the perfect goalkeeper. But Newcastle need to find a goalkeeper. I don't think January is going to be where they find a goalkeeper. It's going to be in the summer. But 2026 may see us have to bite the bullet and bring in a proper big-time goalkeeper to fill that void, to be the number one for the next 5-6 years to come. I don't think James Trafford's the answer. I'm just putting it out there. Maybe I'm wrong. But let me know in the comments. But I think that's too much for James Trafford right now in his career. I think that you go and sign someone like a Diego Costa from Porto, a proper established goalkeeper who can do both, in my opinion. But that will cost you 50 million quid. Whether Newcastle will do that or not remains to be seen. But going into the rest of the season, if the window's strong, they may have a chance because the league is still so tight that they could turn this around and they could still get the European slots in terms of maybe five to seventh in the Premier League. But I don't see enough of it. I don't see enough consistency in the play. There's too many underperformers. I see people saying, oh, they're trying hard. They are trying hard, but they're not clinical enough. There's no end product. The passing's too wayward. The defense isn't focused enough, isn't disciplined enough. We lose the ball. We can't sit on a lead. We can't chase a game and pull it back and win a game. And these are key factors in teams getting enough results to get up the table. Optimistically, I've got us finishing on 59 points, which last season would have got you 8th or 9th. It might get you 7th or 6th this season because the league is so tight. And everybody's inconsistent outside of Arsenal, City and Villa, probably. Everybody's inconsistent. But the way I see it going forward, I think Newcastle have left too many points on the table in the first half of this season for us to certainly finish in the top 5. I think at the very best, we'll finish top 7th. Very best. I think it's most likely going to be 8th to 10th, in my opinion. Now, that would mean no European football for Newcastle United next season. And this will be the litmus test for Eddie Howe. And I think 2026 is going to be a big year for Newcastle and a big year for Eddie Howe in particular, because if he does not get European football, that's when we'll see what the PIF are all about. If the PIF deem that as okay, we still trust this guy, we'll roll the dice with him again, and he can go again next season, then fine. But what it also means is you lose a lot of big players. Sandro Tonali will be gone. I think he'll be gone regardless if we get top 5 or not. I think Tonali's already looking at the exit door. I'm sorry, but I think he is. Anthony Gordon will want to leave. Sven Botman might be itching to leave. Maybe even Bruno Guimaraes might move on. I think he'd be lesser of the few, but we're talking about Joe Linton maybe moving on as well. He's in his 30s now, Joe. He's not as impactful as he used to be. Trippier, Fabian Schär, players like that getting to the point where they're getting a little bit too old to impact the squad. So I think 2026 is going to see a lot of familiar faces have to move away from the football club. But if Eddie Howe stays, I think a lot of those players may still be here in terms of the older players. But do you really want to go into 2026 season, 2026, 2027 with 35, 36-year-old defenders, who can't give you the same level of intensity in games, and when they get injured, they're out for months, not weeks? Do you really want to do that? That's a real concern for me. And I think people like City will come calling for Tino Livramento in the summer, whether we're Champions League or not. That's going to be a test for Newcastle. I understand Tino not signing his contract. I probably wouldn't either if I was Tino Livramento. He's got no affinity to Newcastle. He's not a Geordie boy. He's not a Newcastle fan from birth like Lewis Hall was. So he's got no reason to sign a new contract. So 2026 is going to be a big, big change. I don't think we get European football at the end of the season. I'm just putting it out there. And for the record, I'd love to be wrong. For all you people in the comments telling me I'm negative and all that stuff, that's fine. You guys be positive. That's cool, right? Just we don't need to be abusive to each other. I don't believe this manager will get us European football this season. And these players won't get us European football this season because they've left too many points out. First half of the season, points that they should have got and they didn't get. And that's my issue with that. And I think that's why we'll not get Europe. And if the PIF are serious about being as ambitious as they are, the manager will then leave the football club in the summer of 2026. And then that will mean a new manager coming to the football club. Now, if or when that happens, that will be really interesting to see what the club do about that. Do they go big? Do they go and get a big name, somebody who's an improvement on Eddie Howe? Do they go and get someone like a Nagelsmann, for example, who's like a younger model of Howe, but a better model of Howe in terms of what he's done in his career? Do they go and try and get somebody like a Conte to come back? His Premier League experience too. He wins silverware wherever he goes. Do I dare say it? Do they go and get Jose for one last hurrah in the Premier League? Who brings that stardust, that massive headline name that can bring players to the football club, regardless if he got Champions League or not, because they want to work with Jose Mourinho. I don't know. But I generally sitting here can't tell you which way PIF will turn. If Eddie Howe doesn't get European football, which I don't think that he will, I think it's a huge transitional year for Newcastle United in 2026. And the year before that was a massive transitional year, as we felt, because one silverware. We felt like everything was on an upward curve. But 2026, I think, will be a total year of change at the football club. Whether Eddie stays or goes, there's going to be a lot of these players, I think, will be moving on from the football club, regardless of of maybe where we finish in the table. I think if we get Champions League, you may hold on to some of them, but I generally do think we're going to see a few bodies leaving this football club, and bodies need to come in as well. New players, fresher players, younger players, players that maybe the manager, if it is Eddie Howe, can work with and develop again and go again. But I think 2026 is going to be a massive transitional year for Newcastle, and I don't think it's going to end with any silverware or a European Cup. I don't think we'll beat City over 2 legs. I'd love to be wrong. Click this up by all means. Love to be wrong. But I don't think we've got enough in the locker to beat City over 2 legs. And I don't think we'll win the FA Cup either. Certainly won't win the Champions League. That'll be a shock if we do. I'd love to eat my hat if I'm wrong there. But I feel like this squad of players and this manager has taken the club from rock bottom really to an unbelievable place. But it's grown stale. It's stagnated. And it needs a refresh. And I think that's what we'll get at the end of the season. But let me know in the comments below what you guys think about the year ahead, 2026. What do you think it's going to look like for Newcastle? Again, are you reserving judgment on the manager? Do you think he'll turn this around? Have you had enough of the manager? Do you want to change? And if you want to change, do you want to change now in time to save the season? Or do you want to change at the end of the season where I think the owners will probably make it? And who would you want to sign in the January transfer window? Which area do you think is more important to address? We'll try and do a little bit more of an in-depth transfer show in the next kind of week or so, I think, before we really get into the nuts and guts of the window. But thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for everything in 2025. Let's hope 2026 is a great year of health and happiness for us all. But more importantly, that the football club starts getting results and climbing the table and getting back to where we want it to be. That's what I want. That's what any Newcastle fan wants, regardless of how they feel about the manager or the current state of the situation. You know, we can have a difference of opinion, but we all want Newcastle United to be the most successful version that it can be. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a belter, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.
Heroes celebrate. They have done it.